Throughout history, many great figures have left a profound impact on human civilization. From brilliant leaders and exceptional scientists to visionary thinkers, they have helped shape the world as we know it today.
The man known to history as Karl Marx was born on the 5th of May 1818 in the town of Trier in Western Germany, not far from the border with Luxembourg today. In the first half of the 19th century, this town was in the midst of a large section of the German Rhineland, which had come under the rule of the Kingdom of Prussia in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Marx's father was Heinrich Marx, a German lawyer of Jewish heritage, whose own father was a rabbi. His original name was Herschel Levy, but he changed it right around the time of Karl's birth, after renouncing his Judaism and converting to Lutheran Christianity in the face of the anti-Semitism which was mounting in Europe in the 19th century. He was a successful lawyer, and the family owned some vineyards from which they acquired an additional income. Karl's mother was Henrietta, a Dutch-born woman who had married Heinrich in 1814. The marriage resulted in 9 children, Karl being the third. 2 of these would die in infancy, and as a result, Karl grew up with 6 siblings. The Marx household enjoyed a relatively affluent life when Karl was growing up. When he was still an infant, they moved to a 10-room townhouse in Trier, a clear sign of their upper-middle-class economic status. It was a secular household, interested in the ideas of rationalism and liberalism that had permeated Europe during the Enlightenment of the 18th century. Karl was homeschooled by his well-educated father until he was 12 years of age. Thereafter, he was sent to a school in Trier run by Hugh Wittenbach, a figure who ran into considerable controversy not long after, owing to his radical teaching curriculum, one which led the Prussian authorities to intervene to actively change the methods being used and the texts being read at the gymnasium. Other than these issues, Marx's childhood was seemingly fairly uneventful. He rarely reflected on his younger years in any of his own writings. Marx's life and political philosophy was shaped by the events which were just beginning to accelerate on the European continent as he was growing up as a child. The Industrial Revolution had begun in England back in the 1770s, when proto-industrialists, specifically ones who controlled the country's textile trade, began to realize that they could substantially increase their profits if they introduced machines to carry out the weaving process that had traditionally been done by hand, and then that they could engage in what we now call economies of scale if they placed large numbers of these machines in one building, what would soon come to be called a factory. Soon as steam engines were introduced into the mix to accelerate the production process, the demand for coal to fuel them ballooned. This was how the Industrial Revolution began. It did not spread quickly to Europe, though. The rest of the continent was slow to absorb the new ideas, a lethargy that was augmented by the unrest created by the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars between 1792 and 1815. However, from the 1820s onwards, many countries on the continent began to industrialize at speed. The Low Countries came first, followed by parts of northern France and western Germany, particularly in the Rhineland and Ruhr regions, where coal and mineral wealth were abundant. Marx was thus born into a region that was emerging as one of the main centers of the Industrial Revolution on the continent, from the 1820s onwards, as he was growing up there. The Industrial Revolution was a poisoned chalice in many respects. It was one of the key social and economic phenomena which created the modern world. The economies of the European states and other Western countries in the Americas, like the United States, Canada, and Argentina, began to experience historically unprecedented growth as a result of it, and the material attainment of people in countries like England and Germany became greater than any society in human history had ever seen. Our lives of convenience and comfort in the 21st century are, in many ways, the byproduct of the Industrial Revolution. Yet it came with its own strains. In medieval and early modern times, most people were agricultural workers. They worked hard at certain times of the year, specifically during the sowing season and the harvest. But for much of the year, they had little work to do. Life was precarious and people were quite poor in the main. Yet it was also not overtly onerous at times. Industrialization changed that. Reforms to how agriculture was practiced and booming populations forced large throngs of people into emergent industrial cities like Manchester, Sheffield, Newcastle, Liège, and Aachen that had been minor towns a generation or two earlier. There they were paid poorly to work extremely long hours in factories and mines, or laying down railway tracks and building steamships from the 1830s and 1840s onwards. Adult men were expected to work up to 70 hours a week in some scenarios, and women and children as young as 8 or 9 were working 55 or 60 hours a week. When these urban workers, or the proletariat as figures like Marx would soon term them, went home, it was to cramped tenements that were plagued by outbreaks of the Blue Death, the cholera epidemic that ravaged Europe's industrial cities between the 1830s and the 1890s. This is the situation which needs to be borne in mind when assessing Marx's subsequent career. In 1835, after turning 17 in May of that year, Marx was sent to study at the University of Bonn, not far to the north of his native Trier. A clash with his father over what the future course of his studies and career might be led to KARL, who was more inclined towards philosophy, partly studying law. His attentions never focused on it. Instead, he was more interested in extracurricular activities, such as his membership of the Trier Tavern Club, the purpose of which can be assumed from its name. Within a year, his parents, exasperated by his seeming waywardness, insisted that KARL transfer to the University of Berlin, a more prestigious and a stricter university. He would study here for the next several years, for a BA and then a more advanced degree. These were formative times for him. His father died in 1838, and despite their disagreements, the pair had been relatively close. Heinrich's death left an emotional and material void. The surviving members of the large Marx family now suddenly finding themselves with a precarious financial future. Meanwhile, in Berlin, KARL experimented with various different career options, for a time trying his hand at writing fictional novels and plays in the late 1830s, though he soon abandoned these literary aspirations. Ultimately, Marx was drawn to the philosophical thought of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel while studying at Berlin. Hegel had only recently died in the Prussian capital in 1831, and there were many figures at the University of Berlin who had known and worked with him. His letters were also being edited there, making study of Hegel's thought somewhat fashionable at the time. Marx was soon a member of the young Hegelians. a group of students and radicals who were critical of the conservative Prussian government and who believed, in line with Hegel's thought, that the liberty of the individual and the creation of a more permissive society was social goods. It was through his study of Hegel and association with the young Hegelians that Marx ended up beginning a doctoral dissertation at the University of Vienna under the supervision of Bruno Bauer, a former student of Hegel's. This was entitled "The Difference Between the Democritian and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature," and involved a comparative analysis of the work of Democritus and Epicurus, two ancient Greek philosophers of the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, one of whom, Democritus, had also been a formative figure in the early history of physics, hypothesizing the existence of atoms, while Epicurus was the founder of the Greek philosophical school of Epicureanism. Marx defended the thesis in 1841. Following the completion of his studies at Berlin and Jena, Marx was giving considerable thought to pursuing an academic career, and had taught occasionally by then. However, the environment within the lands of the Kingdom of Prussia was far from conducive to this, and the young Hegelians had been monitored by the authorities owing to the perception of them as being politically radical. He consequently decided to become a political writer, yet soon fell foul of the press censors in Berlin. With this, realizing that there was little room for the free expression of his ideas in the lands of the Kingdom of Prussia, Marx left for Paris in October 1843. It was the beginning of a period of some 6 years in which he moved around quite a lot. 2 years in the French capital, for instance, were brought to an end in 1845 after Marx and a cohort of other radical political writers were expelled after the French government was requested to do so by the Prussians on account of their having published several articles that were critical of the Prussian government. This led Marx to Brussels, the capital of the Kingdom of Belgium, one of Europe's newest independent nations, having only emerged after centuries of Burgundian, Spanish, and Austrian rule following the Belgian Revolution of 1830. He would work from Brussels for the next 3 years, before also being expelled from there for breaking a promise not to engage in subversive activity. A brief stint would follow in Cologne, before Marx made London his home in 1849. By the time Marx adopted the lifestyle of a nomadic political writer in 1843, he was a married man. His wife was Jenny von Westphalen, a member of a family of the lower aristocracy in Western Germany. She was 4 years older than KARL, and they had known each other in Trier as children and as teenagers. They later resumed their acquaintance and married in 1843, despite the reservations of her family about marrying the thickly bearded, bohemian, and seemingly dissolute political writer. Such relationships could be complicated. KARL would remain on good terms with Jenny's brother Ferdinand, who served as Minister of the Interior of Prussia for much of the 1850s, a man who oversaw policies which were the antithesis of everything Marx advocated for. The marriage would result in 7 children, though 4 would die in infancy and childhood, a very high percentage at a time when infant mortality was rapidly declining owing to medical advancements. The 3 that lived into their adult years were all daughters: Jenny, Laura, and Eleanor. Each would become political actors, writers, and socialists. The Marx family life was chaotic. They were never wealthy or even comfortable, living in a 2-room house for many years in London, while they spent many years moving around with KARL renting homes under aliases, to avoid political interference in his actions. He could be viewed as a neglectful father who favored advancing his own writing career over the material well-being of his family. Though he was otherwise written about by those who knew the family as a doting father, and his daughter's later decisions speak to an affinity for their father's work. Rumors of an affair later in Marx's life with the family housekeeper Helena, one that produced an illegitimate son, Friedrich Demuth, have never been substantiated and remain largely hearsay. These itinerant years moving between Berlin, Paris, Brussels, and Cologne in the 1840s were some of the most productive of Marx's life. He composed numerous books and articles during this time, although he could not acquire a publisher for many of them on account of their content, and his reputation as someone who the Prussian censors and others abroad were watching. These ranged over a wide range of subjects. A critique of Hegel's philosophy of right was, as the title clearly indicates, a reflection on elements of Hegel's philosophical ideas. Other work assessed the philosophical views of James Mill and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, two relatively contemporary philosophers from Scotland and France. A piece entitled On the Jewish Question was published in 1844 and reflected on the issue of Jewish liberties in the Kingdom of Prussia. It has strangely led to accusations of anti-Semitism being pointed at Marx, despite the fact that he was himself Jewish, albeit the son of a secular Jewish father who had converted to Christianity for broadly social and economic reasons. Finally, in 1847, Marx delivered a lecture which was later published under the title of Wage, Labor, and Capital. Here he began to lay out his ideas concerning material progress and how industrialization and the accumulation of capital were driving class conflicts across Europe. Throughout these years, Marx was beginning his long partnership with Friedrich Engels. Engels was a fellow German. He was 2.5 years younger than Marx and hailed from a considerably wealthier family. His father, Friedrich Sr., was a textile businessman who owned mills and factories in the town of Barmen in western Germany and also in Salford, a suburb of the industrial metropolis that Manchester in the north of England had become on the back of its central role in the cotton industry during the Industrial Revolution. Friedrich Jr.'s parents had hoped that he would follow in the family business, but by the time he was 20 years old, he was already demonstrating a critical attitude towards his family's wealth. In 1841, he was called out for mandatory military service in Prussia, something which Marx had been excused on the basis of poor health. In Berlin, Engels began attending lectures at the University of Berlin, became interested in the work of Hegel, and later bonded with Marx over shared interests and political views. After they first met, late in 1842, they would collaborate on a huge number of co-authored works, though Engels was a substantial writer in his own right. His 1845 book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, is, for instance, considered a major reflection on the poverty and squalor that was attendant on industrialization in the middle of the 19th century. Many decades later, it was also owing to Engels that the second and third volumes of Marx's foremost work, Das Kapital, were published posthumously. Marx and Engels were not just co-authors of several works together. They were also allies in political action. One such early endeavor was the formation of the Communist Correspondence Committee. This was an organization formed of individuals like them, with similar views on politics economics, and society, who lived in Brussels, London, Paris, and Cologne, 4 cities in relatively close proximity to each other in Western Europe, between which members of the committee could exchange letters speedily. The name communist was adopted as it had come into vogue in parts of Western and Central Europe in the late 1830s and 1840s to describe individuals whose political views were akin to the radical left wing of the Jacobins clubs that had led the French Revolution through the first half of the 1790s. They viewed themselves as being politically sympathetic to the sans-culottes of Paris during the Revolution. The working-class Parisians, who had been responsible, amongst other things, for the storming of the Bastille prison and the decision to remove the royal family from Versailles and place them under virtual house arrest in Paris in 1789. This was in part the origin of the term communist, though over time it would also take on the additional meaning of someone who is in favor of the communal ownership of goods within a society. The Communist Correspondence Committee soon joined into a union with a similar group known as the League of the Just, after a conference in London in the early summer of 1847. The new entity was termed the Communist League. From its inception, Marx and Engels were prominent figures in the Communist League. They attended a second meeting of its membership in London in late November and early December 1847. It was decided there that Marx and his colleague would draw up a manifesto that would outline what the Communist League sought to achieve. The work progressed quickly. Over the space of about 6 weeks in the winter of 1847, Marx drafted what would become the Communist Manifesto, and then had Engels review it. The writing process was chaotic, and Marx procrastinated on it in January 1848. Eventually, he finished the typescript in early February and sent it to London, where the publishing team for the Communist League sped it through publication. It was published in the English capital late in February 1848. Though the text was attributed to both Marx and Engels, most assessments of the writing process tend to argue that Marx was the primary author, with Engels offering only minimal interventions, albeit the general tenor and spirit of what was contained in it had been forged in conversations between the duo over half a decade prior to Marx putting pen to paper. The Communist Manifesto, for such a consequential text in modern world history, is actually very short, more like a pamphlet than a book. It stretches to just around 14,000 words in modern editions, depending on the editorial conventions used. Marx immediately set out his view that history is a story of struggles between different economic and social classes. In ancient Rome, this was between patricians, plebeians, and slaves. In the medieval era, it was between lords and knights and the serfs that worked their fields. Now, in the industrial age, Marx asserted the clash was between the bourgeois factory owners and professional classes who ran society and the growing proletariat of urban workers. He castigated the changes industrialization had inflicted on society, stating, quote, "The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. Everywhere, the bourgeois monopoly on industrial power and capitalism was creating misery in places where material progress should have been improving people's lives." He was especially critical of the manner in which child labor in the factories and mines had proliferated. The solution, Marx argued, was held by the Communist League and other groups like it. Private property ought to be abolished, and henceforth, factories, mines, shipyards, farms, and other economic and social utilities should be held under communal state ownership. With this done, collective decisions could be made by the proletariat to expand access to education, create better working conditions, and allow for an equal share in the benefits of industrial growth and material progress. Marx closed his pamphlet with a famous phrase, which was the slogan of the Communist League. "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." The Communist Manifesto has become one of the most controversial texts ever written. This is in sharp contrast to how uncontroversial it really was at the time. It was basically the articulation of the policy platform of a new political movement. Political groups and parties published policy documents all the time. Revolutionary documents and idealist political statements of this kind were also hardly novel. In England, in the Civil War period of the 1640s, a wide range of revolutionary schemes to reorganize the entire foundation of society had been devised. One figure from that era, John Milton, a political idealist, had influenced Marx considerably in the views he professed in his work Paradise Lost. The very concept of establishing a United States of America out of the British 13 colonies lying between New Hampshire and Georgia was radical when the Founding Fathers devised it in 1776. Perhaps most importantly, political treatises which argued in favor of political and social utopias of the kind outlined in the Communist Manifesto had been produced as far back as the 4th century BC, when the Athenian philosopher and political scientist Plato composed The Republic, a lengthy commentary on the ideal state. Plato had argued in favor of something akin to the communal ownership of goods, and one could also argue that the English Lord Chancellor of the reign of King Henry VIII, Sir Thomas More, had offered up proto-communist ideas in his famous treatise, Utopia. In this regard, the text was hardly a completely new departure in European political thought. It has been speculated that Marx was largely drunk while writing the Communist Manifesto, something which would be quite ironic, given that this short treatise would go on to become one of the most influential texts ever written. Part of the reason he had procrastinated in finishing it in January 1848 was that he had headed to Ghent to establish a branch of the Communist League there, and spent a week and a half in the smaller Belgian city, much of it spent intoxicated, before returning to Brussels, where an ultimatum from the League headquarters in London to finish the manifesto was waiting for him. He then rushed it off over the next few days. That Marx was imbibing throughout this period was unquestionable. The available evidence certainly suggests that he met the definition of a high-functioning alcoholic. He began drinking a lot during his early student days in Bonn, and continued the habit for the next half a century. This was not the average diet of almost perpetual beer consumption that characterized European life in early modern and pre-modern times, especially in cities where drinking alcohol was safer than consuming disease-ridden water. But instead, Marx had a penchant for wine and liquor, all in tandem with a rich diet and cigars. By the late 1840s, by which time he was entering his 30s, he had a growing range of health problems, some probably related to liver disease. Even as the Communist Manifesto was being published in London at the end of February 1848, a wave of revolutionary fervor was sweeping across Europe. This began in the city of Palermo, on the island of Sicily, in January 1848, and rapidly spread across the continent. By March and April, major revolts were underway in places like Poland, Hungary, France, much of Germany, Denmark, the Swiss Confederacy, and Ireland, while virtually every other country witnessed popular protest, if not full-blown revolts. The revolutions of 1848, or the springtime of the people as it would become known, led to wide-ranging political changes in countries like France, Hungary, and Italy, and threatened to lead to the overthrow of entire governments in Germany and other regions. In the aftermath of the revolutions, there were crackdowns on perceived political extremism. Marx, who had just moved back to Cologne after coming under pressure from the Belgian government, owing to his political views in the midst of the revolutions sweeping the continent, soon also experienced harassment from the Prussian government on account of his role in the Communist League, and was eventually asked to leave the kingdom entirely. This was the background against which the Marx family relocated to London. Marx would spend the rest of his life based out of the British capital, in a country which was more liberal-minded than virtually any other country in Europe at that time, with extensive censorship practiced in other capitals of a kind which would have precluded him from getting his work published. In London, Marx was inspired enough by the events of 1848 and 1849 across Europe, even though the revolutions had generally ended in suppression and violent crackdowns, to begin now researching and writing some retrospective commentaries on that other great European revolutionary movement, the French Revolution of 1789, and its aftermath in the 1790s. For communists and for left-leaning socialists of all hues, the French Revolution was one of the defining events of human history. Where the American Revolution had been primarily driven by well-to-do urban bourgeois types and wealthy plantation owners, the French insurrection had been led to a significant extent by the sans-culottes, urban workers of Paris, and the Jacobin clubs of radical revolutionaries. It had been both a movement to overthrow the ancien regime of crown, aristocracy, and church, and an effort to establish a completely new type of society. Marx and many others wished to launch a new revolution of this kind. To that end, from 1849 into the early 1850s, he wrote extensively in an effort to analyze what went wrong in France in the 1790s to foil the revolution and lead it into the monarchy of Napoleon Bonaparte, contrasting it with the recent rise to power of Charles-Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew, as President of France during the Revolution of 1848. He would subsequently proclaim himself to be Napoleon III, a new emperor of the French. Marx was clear. The bourgeois had manipulated the French proletariat in a manner which led them to accept an abandonment of the revolution in 1799 and the acceptance of Bonaparte as first consul and then Emperor of the French in 1804. Similar principles had recently led to the undermining of the 1848 revolution in France and the rise of another Bonaparte to power. Marx might have been anxious to comment on and analyze the various revolutionary movements across the continent, but he also had to make a living in London after he moved there. He acquired some work as a journalist, writing as a London-based correspondent for the New York Daily Tribune. while also writing occasionally for several other publications. Much of this involved digesting British political developments and making them intelligible for an American audience, especially developments at the British Parliament at Westminster during a very busy time in the country's legislative history. It was precarious work, and Marx was often only paid for articles that were accepted for publication, making his income stream unstable. The Marx family were not poverty-stricken, yet they hardly lived an affluent life in London, and KARL would have had difficulties in continuing his unpaid research and writing had it not been for financial support from ENGELS, whose family's wealth provided him with an independent income stream. Marx was also interested in these years in London in the ongoing political tensions in the United States, ones which focused on the issue of slavery and which would eventually spill over into the American Civil War in 1861. This was based on his observations of the fractious state of US politics in the 1850s, and then the final descent into conflict after the election of Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 presidential election. However, his collection of essays on the topic, published as a series of articles for the New York Daily Tribune and Die Presse in Vienna between 1860 and 1868, also attempted a wider analysis of the economic divisions between the free northern states and the slave-owning southern states, which had caused the conflict in the first place. Marx was firmly on the side of the Union in the war and the anti-slavery cause, so much so that it ultimately cost him his job writing for the New York Daily Tribune, after the board of the paper decided on a markedly neutral stance in the war in 1863, arguing that a peaceful resolution between North and South, one that might allow for a retention of slavery of some kind in places like Virginia and the Carolinas, was possible. Marx withdrew from the paper at that juncture and acquired other work with Die Presse and other outlets. Luckily, by then, one of his other books, a contribution to the critique of political economy, published in 1859, was selling well enough that Marx was on a firmer financial footing. The end of his time writing for the New York Daily Tribune and his increased income allowed Marx to concentrate on a large work which had been in the firmament for some time. This would be the major distillation of his political ideas. He spent much time writing it in the reading rooms of the British Museum in London, the archival and library sections of which are the British Library today. It was here that Marx drew up hundreds of pages of notes on all manner of issues relating to class relations and the like. The result would be a 3-volume work published gradually over several decades and entitled Das Kapital, Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, which translates as Capital, a critique of political economy. The first volume of Das Kapital was published in 1867. It was a lengthy work in and of itself, one which runs to 500 to 600 pages in most modern editions. It was then supplemented by Volume 2 and Volume 3, published posthumously in 1885 and 1894 respectively, after Engels finished the two texts based on Marx's very extensive notes and drafts. Collectively, the 3 volumes tend to run to over 1,000 pages in modern editions that tried to publish them in 1 volume, and that can only be achieved by using a very small print or synopsizing substantial sections of the text. It is therefore an extremely long work, running upwards of 1 million words in most modern editions, if footnotes or endnotes are included. Given its sheer size, there are a great many elements to Das Kapital, far more than with the rather paltry Communist Manifesto. Two key facets of it should be noted. Das Kapital offered the clearest articulation of Marx's views on historical materialism. This is the view of history as primarily being characterized by conflict between different economic classes. This is not an entirely groundbreaking idea today. In the middle of the 19th century, though, it was trailblazing. Up to this time, most historians, or those who deployed historical arguments, tended to assess human history as being about a conflict of different ethnic groups or of empires, kingdoms, and nation-states. Pick up a 19th century European history book, and you will invariably be greeted by chapters outlining conflicts between England and France, the German states and the papacy, Spain and Portugal. Kings, queens, lords, and popes featured heavily, and religion and territorial power was allegedly what motivated them. Conversely, little was said about what the vast majority of the population of such countries did, and what their motivations were. Marx was writing in reaction to this. He argued that history was basically a clash of different economic classes rather than nation-states. In this reimagining, Western European history in the High Middle Ages was not, for example, a tale of the French and English crowns waging war on one another, but of the French and English nobility collectively oppressing the feudal peasantry. Over time, the relations between economic classes changed, as different technological innovations transformed the modes of production of food and goods. Therefore, Europe's recent history had been tumultuous and was resulting in class warfare owing to the recent innovations of the Industrial Revolution, ones which were pitting the bourgeoisie, a class that had in turn defeated the old feudal nobility centuries earlier, against the new industrial proletariat. To Marx's mind, historical materialism offered a method of explaining nearly all historical developments. While many people might disagree with the political ends towards which Marx was working in formulating this theory, or argue that he placed too much emphasis on material issues as being the fulcrum on which all historical events pivoted, there is no denying that he contributed to a fundamental re-evaluation of historical methodology, one which highlighted how economic developments and class conflict were just as important as nationalism or the actions of leading rulers and statesmen. This concept of historical materialism is directly related to one of the other key facets of Marxist thought as presented in Das Kapital. It is called the Marxist dialectic, or dialectical materialism. In fashioning this, Marx was responding to the dialectical methods espoused by Hegel decades earlier. The Hegelian dialectic argued that ideas were often in fundamental conflict with each other, but that this tension could result in a more sophisticated outcome. For instance, a person might put forward an idea or thesis concerning a philosophical issue. Then, a second person or group would put forward a counter-argument or antithesis. In many instances, neither would be entirely correct, but the fundamental tension between the two arguments would result in a more evolved synthesis that borrowed from both thesis and antithesis to form a synthesis. The Hegelian concept ultimately has its roots in the philosophical methods of Plato. Marx now borrowed and altered this dialectical approach and injected arguments about political economy and metaphysics into it. What he was arguing was that society and nature had a physical existence beyond the impression of it, which human beings form in their mind, and therefore was worth studying independent of individual perceptions of society. In this, he was rejecting Hegel's thoughts and a long line of other European philosophers, going back to René Descartes, who had founded the Cartesian school of metaphysics in the middle of the 17th century. For Marx, the individual could be ignored to some extent. What was significant within this dialectical method was that economic groups were in tension with one another, leading to changes in the physical world, though ones which were often contradictory or difficult to explain. The Marxist dialectic is one of the more complex elements to Marx's thoughts in Das Kapital and his political and philosophical outlook more generally. It is also one of the most controversial. Many hold that in placing emphasis on the material world and how it operated, and in rejecting Hegel's Cartesianism, that Marx was essentially rejecting the fundamental value of the individual in society. The argument here is that in stating that the material relations between economic groups in the world and how they relate to nature, rather than individual perceptions of the same, were what was important, Marx was essentially trivializing the value of individuals. It is easy to see why this might be deemed a controversial viewpoint, particularly so when we consider that Joseph Stalin produced a paper entitled Dialectical and Historical Materialism that was first published in 1938 in the midst of the Great Purge that he was inflicting on Russia at the time. The argument could follow that Marx's dialectical reasoning was consequently responsible for the worst excesses of the Soviet Union and other communist regimes in decades to come. Nor is the Marxist dialectic the only thing which has been deemed controversial in Marx's work. His view of historical materialism, while a very useful corrective to the traditional view of history being a clash between kingdoms and nation-states, when overstated, has led to an overt emphasis on class struggles as being behind all historical phenomena. Finally, his advocacy for the communal ownership and management of goods might have been considered utopian by many in the 20th century. But what Marx overlooked was the possibility of authoritarianism being used to achieve this. Marx was not an authoritarian by any stretch of the imagination himself. Yet he failed to realize that efforts to put his ideas into practice could result in tyrannical regimes, particularly so if attempted in countries like Russia, which had a centuries-long political culture of autocracy. Practical measures to try and further the communist mission in the real world, and not just on paper, were underway even as Marx was writing up the first volume of Das Kapital in the mid-1860s. In 1864, a coalition of socialist, communist, and other left-wing radical groups from around Europe was formed at a meeting in the Queen's Theatre in London on the 28th of September. They called themselves the International Working Men's Association, though today, in communist historiography, this is known as the First International, it being the first entity that claimed to represent communist groups from all over the world. Though in reality, at the time, that meant Europe in practice, as communism had barely spread anywhere else, a few advocates in the Americas being the only major exception. The onus for the gathering was the Poland uprising against Russian rule there in 1863, and the realization that grassroots labor organizations and those that represented groups like the oppressed Polish subjects of the Russian Empire could meet with greater success if they organized themselves on an international scale. By transcending international borders in this way, they could aspire to mimic the revolutions of 1848 one day. Marx was heavily involved in the First International. However, the First International soon descended into conflict, specifically between a more staunchly communist wing led by Marx and an anarchist wing led by the Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin, a seminal figure in the history of political anarchism. The dispute came to a head at a conference at The Hague in the Netherlands in 1872, and the First International effectively collapsed over the next few years. A Second International would not emerge until 1889, after Marx's death. The split in the First International was in many ways fueled by the events of 1871. In mid-March of that year, as France, and in particular, the city of Paris tried to recover from the shock of its swift defeat by Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War, radical political groups had seized control of the French capital. The Paris Commune would control the city for 2.5 months before its bloody suppression by the government of the fledgling Third French Republic, resulting in the deaths of anywhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people. The Commune cannot be considered a wholly communist revolution, as the communards were a loose coalition of political radicals, but it certainly involved communist and radical socialist elements. Marx engaged in a flurry of activity from London when news arrived of what was happening in Paris in March 1871. The treatise that he prepared in response to it was entitled The Civil War in France, though by the time he finished it, the Commune had already been suppressed, and the text needed to be edited to put it into the past tense for publication that summer. We get a sense of how overly optimistic Marx's view of the Commune was from this passage. Wonderful indeed was the change the Commune had wrought in Paris. No longer any trace of the meretricious Paris of the Second Empire. No longer was Paris the rendezvous of British landlords, Irish absentees, American ex-slaveholders, and shoddy men, Russian ex-serf owners, and Wallachian boyards. No more corpses at the morgue. No nocturnal burglaries, scarcely any robberies. In fact, for the first time since the days of February 1848, the streets of Paris were safe, and that without any police of any kind. Whatever the merits of the Commune may or may not have been, to present Paris as a paragon of peace and safety in the late spring of 1871 stretches credulity. The events of the early 1870s, with the brief possibility of a new revolution in France, and then the gradual collapse of the First International in the years that followed, were the final era of major political involvement by Marx. He turned 60 in 1878, and by then his health was seriously declining. He continued to write, though much of his time was absorbed in preparing the second and third volumes of Das Kapital, two works which he never fully completed and brought to publication. Engels would achieve this after his death. A number of his later writings, correspondence, and minor publications were of note. For instance, in 1881, he discussed with Vera Sassulij, a Russian communist who is a forgotten but formative figure in the history of the movement in that country, whether Russia could aspire towards communism, The traditional Marxist view being that societies would have to move from feudalism to capitalism, then capitalism to socialism, and from socialism to communism. Industrialization being a necessary process in the development of capitalism into socialism. Given future events, it was an interesting correspondence. By then, several thousand copies of Marx's work had been published in Russian, though he would have found the fact that Russia would soon become the epicenter of the communist movement very curious, given that he had envisaged it as a political ideology for countries like England, Germany, or even France, that were well along the path of industrialization already and had an urban proletariat to drive the revolution as a result. Karl's wife Jenny died in December 1881. His own health was not good by then, and it declined precipitously thereafter. Indeed, it had never been good. As early as the late 1830s, Marx had been excused from military service in Prussia on the basis of ill health. What exactly was involved is not 100% clear. He may have been suffering from some form of pleurisy, even at this early stage. This was compounded by issues brought on by his borderline alcoholism, exacerbated by poor living conditions in London. He did everything wrong from a modern health perspective thereafter, working long hours, having a poor diet, smoking, and then adding sleep aids into the mix when he developed insomnia later in life. He may have had other conditions. Ultimately, it is hard to tell from the limited medical records available. What is clear is that he developed a case of catarrh right at the beginning of 1882 that reduced his ability to breathe properly. His health continued to decline from then onwards, and Marx died in London on the 14th of March 1883 at 64 years of age. He was almost penniless at the time, and friends and political colleagues put some money together to organize for his burial in Highgate Cemetery in the city. The funeral was a very modest affair, attended by Engels and around a dozen other people, hardly a large showing for a figure whose writings would, for better or worse, have an enormous impact on the century that followed his own. Even by the time Marx died in 1883, there had been enormous progress made in reforming the worst elements of the relationship between the business and working classes that had been allowed to develop during the first decades of industrialization. Back in 1847, when he and Engels had been brainstorming what would become the Communist Manifesto, the British government under Lord John Russell introduced the Factories Act of 1847, colloquially known as the 10 Hours Act. This enshrined the principle that women and children should never be required by factory owners and managers to work more than 63 hours per week, an upper limit that was quickly reduced to 58 hours in 1848. This might still seem like a very high number of hours. However, it was the beginning of a process of reform, which led to the working conditions of the proletariat improving incrementally over the second half of the 19th century. For a time, governments introduced these measures relatively willingly. Yet workers also began to use their collective bargaining power through trade unions and labor movements late in the century and into the 20th to extract greater concessions from the business classes. It was a time of great conflict, one often marred by violent clashes, like the Homestead Strike in Pennsylvania in the United States in 1892, when the American industrialist Henry Clay Frick brought in strikebreakers to wage war on his own workers. But over time, huge concessions were won in the decades prior to and after Marx's death. Still, Marx would not have been satisfied with this. His observations of industrialization had convinced him that a radical overhaul of the entire system of ownership was needed. Communism, not socialism or labor reform. Many agreed with him. In the course of the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, many communist movements began to appear in industrialized European countries. Many did not have names like the Communist Party, but instead bore names like the Socialist Workers' Party, yet were still adherents of many of the ideas of Marx and Engels. One such was the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, formed in the city of Minsk in what was then the Russian Empire. It soon split into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, the former of which would launch the October Revolution in Russia in 1917, beginning the ascent to power of the Communist Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The emergence of the Soviet Union would inspire many imitators, and as the First World War came to an end in 1918, communist regimes were briefly established in places like Hungary and several major cities in Germany. Ultimately, it would require the defeat of fascism and the advent of the Cold War from 1945 onwards for communism to emerge as a global force. At the height of the Cold War between the 1960s and 1980, the man known to history as Friedrich Engels was born on the 28th of November 1820 in the town of Barmen, on the banks of the river Wupper, which was then among the possessions of the Kingdom of Prussia in the Rhineland in western Germany. The town was later amalgamated into the city of Wuppertal in the 20th century. Engels came from a family of prosperous businessmen in the textiles industry. His father, also called Friedrich Engels, was the grandson of Johann Caspar Engels I, an entrepreneur who built up a successful linen bleaching business under the name Caspar Engels und Sohn. Born in 1796, Friedrich Engels Sr. worked for the family business. After the death of his father, Johann Caspar Engels II, in 1821, he and his brothers were engaged in a lengthy dispute over the inheritance of the business until 1837, when Friedrich Sr. went into business with the Dutch Elman brothers and established cotton mills in Manchester, Barmen, and nearby Engelskirchen. Although Friedrich Sr. had a reputation for unsentimental profiteering and a shrewd business acumen, combined with an austere religious puritanism, he was also an amateur musician who could play several instruments and enjoyed family concerts. In 1819, Friedrich Sr. married Elisabeth von Haar, known to the family as Elisa. She came from a family of clerics and scholars from the nearby town of Hamm. The couple would have 8 children in all, 4 sons and 4 daughters, of whom Friedrich Jr. was the eldest. Owing to her family's intellectual background, Elisa encouraged her son Friedrich's interest in literature and classical mythology. While Friedrich would later break off relations with his namesake father, he remained close to his mother throughout her life. Friedrich Engels was born at a time of political and industrial revolution across Europe. The French Revolution of 1789 saw the adoption of a radical liberal doctrine of universal human rights in France, though it soon descended into bloodshed and terror in the early 1790s. Napoleon Bonaparte's subsequent seizure of power in 1799 as First Consul of France and later as Emperor of the French, restored a sense of stability in France, while his efforts to forge a continent-wide French empire ended in defeat in 1815. Among the factors in Napoleon's defeat in the Napoleonic Wars was the economic superiority of Britain, whose Royal Navy controlled global maritime trade, and the economy of which was the first to industrialize during the second half of the 18th century. France's defeat and the growing prosperity of Britain highlighted the great benefits of industrialization, and soon the continental powers of Europe were seeking to emulate the British example. The Engels family were among the industrial pioneers in the Rhineland, which would become the industrial powerhouse of Germany during the 19th century. And in 1775, Friedrich's great-grandfather introduced mechanical lace-making processes to the region. At the time of Friedrich Jr.'s birth, the population of his native Barmen was around 16,000 people, a figure which increased to 40,000 2 decades later, as the town acquired the reputation of being the German Manchester. Still, all of this industrialization brought problems too, in the shape of a growing urban working class, mired in poverty and working draconian hours, sometimes as much as 60 to 70 hours a week. The Engels factory was among the few enterprises in the region that did not employ child labor, and the family also pursued philanthropic initiatives to support poorer members of society. Little is known about Friedrich Jr.'s early childhood, though he and his siblings spent most of it with their mother, as Friedrich Sr. was preoccupied with managing his business interests. In 1828, Friedrich began attending the local elementary school in Barmen. Although he later criticized his teachers for being conservative and unimaginative, he enjoyed his lessons in chemistry and physics, which inspired a lifelong interest in science. At the age of 14, he was sent to the gymnasium or grammar school at Elberfeld, where he boarded with the headmaster, Dr. Hanschke. Engels claimed that the school was considered one of the best in Prussia, and he'd received a liberal education that included a range of sciences, several ancient and modern languages, as well as history and religion. Friedrich excelled at languages and was introduced to the philosophers of the 18th century Enlightenment, who championed human reason in place of religious superstition. Engels was also interested in German folklore and history, which inspired the romantic patriotism of Johann Gottlieb von Herder and Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Although the conservative Prussian monarchy had acquired the Rhineland following the Napoleonic Wars, a liberal German patriotic movement continued to be influential until 1819, when Prince Clemens von Metternich, the powerful chancellor of the Austrian Empire, adopted the Karlsbad decrees to close down liberal student societies and restrict press freedoms. These Austrian measures were quickly adopted across the lands of the German Confederation, including the Kingdom of Prussia. At Elberfeld, the teenage Engels wrote poetry and essays praising the liberal tradition. These views were at odds with his father, and in 1837, Engels was withdrawn from the gymnasium against his wishes. Instead of being allowed to pursue his passions, Friedrich was introduced to the textile business. In 1838, father and son went to England to inspect Ehrmann and Engels' operation in Manchester. On the way back, they stopped off at the historic port city of Bremen, where young Friedrich was apprenticed to the linen merchant Heinrich Leupold. As a clerk in the trading house, Engels handled international transactions and acquired an understanding of global capitalism in the form of exchange rates, import duties, and profit margins. While there, Engels was also influenced by the radical politics of Junges Deutschland, or Young Germany, a left-wing nationalist organization that rejected the romantic nostalgia for medieval Germany in favor of a forward-looking, democratic Germany, characterized by religious freedom and the abolition of aristocratic privilege. In 1839, Engels wrote his first published work, a poem called The Bedouin, in which he lamented that this once proud Arab people were reduced to performing in the Parisian circus. In addition to these poetic ventures, Engels wrote essays for the journal Telegraph für Deutschland under the pseudonym Friedrich Oswald to avoid associating the respectable Engels family name with his increasingly radical political views, which were interspersed among pieces of literary criticism and travelogues to avoid censorship. During the 1830s, as the textile industry in Baumann began to suffer from competition from not just England, but also new producers in Belgium, France, Austria, and other regions, profits fell and working conditions deteriorated. In 1839, Engels published a set of letters from Wuppertal, highlighting the demoralized, exploited, and often excessively drunken condition of the working population, as many people used growing amounts of alcohol to anesthetize the aches, pains, and psychological pain of working long hours in factories and mines. In his attack on Wuppertal's employers, Engels highlighted the hypocrisy of men who were keen to broadcast their supposed religious devotion to the wider community, while being the worst exploiters of the poorer sections of those communities at the very same time. Such sentiments reflected Engels' own rejection of the dogmatic Protestantism that he had inherited from his father. After he was introduced to David Friedrich Strauss's Life of Jesus, which approached the Bible not as the Word of God, but as a product of its historical context, Engels definitively broke from the Christian faith. Instead, Engels soon embraced the philosophy of Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel, a German philosopher who had only recently died in 1831, and some of whose work was still being published posthumously for the first time in the 1830s and 1840s. Hegel saw historical progress driven by the spirit or self-conscious human reason. While Hegel did not entirely reject the idea of God, he saw God and man as being on a shared path to freedom and progress, rejecting man's subservience to God. In 1841, as part of his year of mandatory military service in the Prussian Guards Artillery, Engels settled in Berlin. In addition to donning a Prussian artilleryman's uniform and taking part in military drills, Engels spent his free time attending lectures at the city's university, known today as the Humboldt University. Hegel had served as chair of philosophy there from 1818 until his death in 1831. While Hegel's emphasis on the state as one of the main drivers of historical development was embraced by Prussian conservatives, Hegel's more radical protégés harnessed the Hegelian dialectic, the concept of deploying an opposed thesis and antithesis in an argument before arriving at a synthesis of the two, to explain the progression of history. In this, it was claimed that each historical era was defined by a prevailing social and political orthodoxy, which was then challenged, ultimately resulting in a political synthesis. For instance, the French Revolution had begun with the orthodoxy of the Ancien Régime and monarchical absolutism. This was then challenged by an antithetical system of radical liberalism through the French Revolution of 1789, before a synthesis of the two systems emerged in the early 19th century, specifically a French monarchy with democratic elements and shorn at the absolutism of the 17th and 18th centuries. Young Hegelians were inspired by this approach to political development to offer a liberal challenge to the conservatism of the Prussians. Engels would spend many evenings discussing philosophical questions in Berlin alehouses with a group of like-minded academics and journalists who gathered around the philosopher Bruno Bar, a former student of Hegel's. In October 1842, Engels' year of national service was complete, and he returned to Barmen. Dismayed by his son's increasing radicalism, Friedrich Engels Sr. resolved to send him to Manchester as general assistant at the Ehrmann and Engels mill there. On his way to England in November 1842, Engels visited the offices of the Rheinische Zeitung newspaper in Cologne, where he met its new editor, Karl Marx, for the first time. Born in Trier in Western Germany in 1818, to a Jewish family that had recently converted to Lutheranism, Marx initially studied law at the University of Bonn before transferring to philosophy at the University of Berlin, where he joined the young Hegelian movement. Since his anti-religious thesis was too controversial for conservative Berlin, Marx left the Prussian capital in 1841, a few months before Engels' arrival, and received his doctorate from the University of Jena. In 1842, he began writing for the newly established Rheinische Zeitung, and immediately revived the fortunes of the struggling paper after becoming its editor. Engels had already contributed to the Rheinische Zeitung. The pair's political, philosophical, and social views would gradually become more and more aligned over the next several years, notably in that both Marx and Engels soon grew to disagree with some of the orthodoxies of Hegelian thought. They would also, within a few years, form one of the most significant intellectual partnerships of the 19th century. When Engels arrived there in December 1842, Manchester was a city of over 300,000 people at the heart of Britain's textiles industry. The French political scientist, Alexis de Tocqueville, fresh from publishing his landmark two-volume study, Democracy in America, had described Manchester as a new Hades, covered in black smoke, emanating from a forest of chimneys, where one cannot escape the, quote, crunching wheel of machinery, or the noise of the furnaces. Although he had made a couple of brief visits to the city before, Engels was shocked at the level of poverty and destitution he encountered. A few months earlier, Manchester experienced the Plug Plot riots, as a series of strikes broke out across the country in August 1842, after the political authorities in London rejected working-class demands for universal male suffrage and labor reforms. Engels worked at the Victoria Mill in Salford, across the River Irwell from Manchester. He attended meetings at the Owenite Hall of Science, an institution founded by followers of the agrarian socialist Robert Owen, who inspired the creation of cooperatives around the country. Engels also established relations with the Chartist movement, a group lobbying for universal male suffrage and annual elections. While Engels was sympathetic to working-class Chartism, he did not believe that reforms within the existing social and political system were sufficient for the emancipation of the English working class. In his critique of industrial capitalism, Engels was influenced by the writings of Thomas Carlyle, who reckoned that the life of a factory worker was worse than that of a medieval serf. Among Engels' guides to the working-class areas of Manchester was Mary Burns, a young woman of Irish extraction in her early 20s. She may have been a domestic servant or a factory worker when she met Engels in early 1843. The two soon became romantic partners and would live together for the next 20 years, though both considered marriage as an oppressive bourgeois institution. Mary introduced Engels to the Irish immigrant community in Manchester, who lived in the most deprived areas of the city, areas that someone like Engels from an upper-class background would rarely have set foot in during the 19th century. Here, Mary provided Engels with an invaluable insight into the condition of the working class that influenced his thinking. Having recognized that German socialist and communist thought had been too theoretical, in 1843, Engels wrote an article entitled Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy for the Deutsche Französische Jahrbücher, Marx's new paper, in which he carried out an empirical analysis of Britain's capitalist political economy, arguing that private property had led to the alienation of man from his natural essence and transformed him into a slave to material goods. For Engels, the abolition of private property would bring forth communism, an emerging political idea in the 1840s, one which favored the creation of a new utopian society in which industrial businesses would be taken over by collective or communal groups of workers. In this way, the average worker would move from being an oppressed individual whose labor was exploited by the bourgeois capitalists to someone in charge of his own destiny. Engels developed these ideas into a series of articles which were then collected into one of his most famous books, The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in German in 1845. Citing not only his first-hand experience of the Manchester slums, but also government records and articles from liberal bourgeoisie newspapers, Engels declared, quote, "I accuse the English bourgeois before the entire world of murder, robbery, and other crimes on a massive scale." While writing about England, he was also issuing a warning to the German bourgeoisie, as he believed that the social crisis that he was witnessing in England would soon spread to the continent. Despite having Mary Burns as his guide, Engels could not avoid stereotyping the Irishman as, quote, "a carefree, cheerful, potato-eating child of nature, wholly unsuited to slaving away in Manchester's factories, and whose only response to his wretched existence was to turn to drink." Engels observed that the dreadful conditions which the Irish endured also served to drive down wages for other workers, leading to widespread poverty. Describing the constant surveillance of factory workers by managers, and the practice of moving the clocks forward by a quarter of an hour so that workers would lose several hours of pay when they arrived for work, Engels concluded that the existence of the English working classes was worse than African slaves in North America. In subsequent sections of his work, Engels observed that the industrial city of Manchester had been purposely built to separate the urban proletariat of poor workers from the capitalist bourgeoisie, a radical departure from his native Barmen, where owners and workers lived in close proximity to each other. While the city of Manchester was home to attractive shops and warehouses and served as a location for business transactions, it was surrounded by high-density working-class districts, crisscrossed by a rabbit warren of alleyways. The more affluent inhabitants lived further out in neighborhoods ordered by regular street patterns, while the wealthiest lived in villas among the surrounding countryside, free from the dirty air. Most ingeniously, the wealthier districts were connected to the center via straight roads lined with respectable shops, so they could travel to the commercial district without witnessing the penury of the working-class slums. Yet, Engels believed that the careful urban zoning carried out by the bourgeoisie to separate themselves from the working classes also created the conditions for the workers to coalesce and develop a sense of class consciousness. This offered the possibility of a class-conscious proletariat soon rising up in response to these poor conditions. Engels saw the clash between the proletariats and the bourgeoisie as the next stage of historical development, leading to the destruction of the big industrial cities in favor of the fusion of town and country. The condition of the working class in England was largely written and compiled in Germany, as Engels left Manchester and returned to Barmen in the summer of 1844. On his way back, he met with Karl Marx in Paris on the 28th of August. Since their previous meeting, Marx had moved to Paris after the Rheinische Zeitung was closed down by the Prussian authorities following a complaint by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia about the paper's commentary on the cause of Polish nationalism. Poland then being largely subsumed within the Kingdom of Prussia and the Russian Empire. Marx was impressed by Engels' writings on the capitalist economy, and the two men now became close ideological allies. As a result of this second meeting, they would become lifelong friends and collaborators, launching a famous partnership that would last for the next 4 decades. The two men had taken independent paths to arrive at the same ideological destination, and during their long collaboration, Engels was content to allow Marx to take the lead in establishing the ideological basis of their philosophy, though he played an important role in structuring Marx's thoughts. The first collaboration was a brief attack on Bruno Bauer and the young Hegelians under the satirical title The Holy Family, which denounced their obsession with the metaphysical Hegelian spirit without acknowledging the role of material wealth and property in determining social structures. On his journey from Paris to Barmen, Engels was excited to see the spread of socialist and communist sentiments in the Rhineland. In early 1845, he and the Jewish German philosopher and social commentator Moses Hess organized a series of meetings about communism among the local bourgeoisie. Engels built on a theme that he had first set out in Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy, arguing that capitalist competition would eventually lead to a society composed of a small number of immensely wealthy individuals and a mass of destitute workers, with nobody in between, building up pressure for a more equitable distribution of wealth. Engels argued that a communist system would be more productive, eliminating the waste of resources expended in competing for the same objective, in favor of the efficient allocation of resources where they are required, while technological innovation could be harnessed for the public good. Engels reassured his conservative audience that communism would be brought about not by violent revolution, but by paternalistic persuasion. Engels won over a handful of converts during each meeting, but his activities brought him to the attention of the authorities, causing great embarrassment to his father, who cut him off from his allowance. This fraught relationship between Friedrich and the rest of the family would prevail for virtually his entire adult life. In the meantime, Marx had been forced to leave Paris for Brussels after fresh complaints about his actions in the French capital. In the spring of 1845, Engels joined him in the Belgian capital. The two friends made a brief trip to England to visit the city's slums and study economic data at Manchester's Cheetham Library. Engels re-established contact with Mary Burns, who joined them when they returned to Belgium in late summer. In Brussels, Marx and Engels lived with their respective partners in neighboring apartments. The two men embarked on their next collaboration, entitled The German Ideology. Although never published in their lifetimes, the book was a key step in the development of their theory of historical materialism, a doctrine which held that historical change was dictated by the transformation from one mode of social organization to another, as determined by economic and technological factors, rather than the actions of nation-states and their rulers, which was the more traditional view of historical causation at the time. Marx and Engels observed that each stage of social transformation was fiercely resisted by the ruling elites, and that only a revolution would bring about a new form of social organization. Such a revolution did not necessarily have to be violent. Marx and Engels believed the establishment of democracy through universal suffrage would eventually bring about communism in a relatively peaceful manner. In line with this view, in 1846, Marx and Engels formed the Communist Correspondence Committee to coordinate the activities of European socialists. From its inception, there was a dogmatic quality to it, with Marx and Engels attempting to impose ideological uniformity on the members of the Correspondence Committee. In this spirit, Engels went to Paris in August 1846 to take on the supporters of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the French philosopher whose 1840 treatise, What is Property?, had influenced Marx and Engels' belief that the very concept of private property was causing a lot of industrial society's problems. Still, Proudhon's prescriptions of socialist cooperation were deemed too idealistic. In June 1847, Engels attended the Congress of the League of the Just in London as its representative from Paris, during which the organization changed its name to the Communist League and adopted the slogan, "Working men of all countries, unite." Engels was tasked with drafting a statement of the League's aims, which initially took the form of a catechism entitled Draft of a Communist Confession of Faith, in which he declared that the aim of communism was to organize society in such a way that every member of it can develop and use all his capabilities and powers in complete freedom and without thereby infringing the basic conditions of this society. Although the text contained much of Marx and Engels' ideas about the proletariat as the vanguard of the socialist revolution, Engels had been forced to compromise with the utopian socialists, and in October produced a second draft, The Principles of Communism. The principles had been produced in advance of a second conference in London, which began in late November. On this occasion, Marx was in attendance, and he and Engels ensured that the principles were adopted unanimously. The two men were then asked to write a manifesto on the basis of these principles. First in London and later in Brussels, Marx and Engels worked on what would become the Communist Manifesto, one of the most influential works of political theory in history. The Communist Manifesto owed much to Engels' observations of the English proletariat in Manchester, which served as the basis for the description of the global proletariat, described as, quote, a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. Marx and Engels cast aside their Hegelian baggage by declaring that the history of all hitherto existing class society is the history of class struggles, ultimately leading to the proletarian revolution. Nevertheless, Marx's literary style came to the fore in his description of the rapid industrial and social development brought about by the bourgeoisie, claiming that the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society, with the consequence that all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face, with sober sense, his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The text went on to articulate how a communist society should be created. Although the text of the Communist Manifesto was the result of considerable intellectual exchange between Marx and Engels, going back to 1843, the treatise was largely authored by Marx, not Engels, though both their names would appear on the cover when it was published in London, late in February 1848. Despite its later influence, the Communist Manifesto had virtually no impact among wider society when it was first published. Instead, Marx and Engels were overtaken by revolution on the streets of Paris and a great many other European capitals. On the 24th of February 1848, the increasingly autocratic King Louis-Philippe I was overthrown and the Second French Republic established in his place in France. The bourgeois democratic revolution predicted by Marx and Engels appeared to be underway, and the two men were keen to play their part. In order to evade attempts by the European monarchies to arrest them as part of wider reactionary crackdowns on political dissidents, they left Brussels and arrived at Paris in early March. The events in Paris inspired demonstrations in Vienna, which led to the resignation of Metternich in March, alongside nationalist uprisings in northern Italy against Austrian rule. By mid-March, the revolution had reached Prussia, where King Frederick William IV was compelled to make liberal concessions in order to keep a hold of his throne. Marx and Engels decided to set up their base in the city of Cologne, where Marx resurrected his old newspaper as the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, calling for a united front between the workers and elements of the bourgeoisie. Engels was sent to Barmen to raise money from his relatives, but came back empty-handed. The honeymoon of the revolutions of 1848 did not last long, and by summer the forces of conservatism and reaction regained the initiative, making some concessions to buy off the liberal bourgeoisie. The ruling classes in places like Germany and Austria isolated the radicals and employed military force to re-establish their authority. By September 1848, Engels was on the run and returned to Paris, from where he embarked on a long journey to Bern in Switzerland. He took a great interest in events in Hungary, where the nationalist leader Lajos Kossuth had taken control of the Diet in Budapest and established a government independent of the Austrian Empire. Kossuth's Hungarian nationalism was opposed by Slavic minorities, who allied with the Austrian army to defeat the Hungarians, while the government in Vienna was also allied with the Russian Empire in crushing nationalist movements in Eastern and Central Europe. Inspired by Kossuth, Engels was determined to return to Germany to fight a guerrilla war against the Prussian authorities and return to Cologne in January 1849. In March, a National Assembly in Frankfurt adopted a liberal imperial constitution for a united Germany and invited King Frederick William IV to be its emperor. The Prussian king's refusal to accept a crown from a popular assembly sparked further risings against Prussian authority, and in May 1849, the workers of Elberfeld formed a revolutionary militia. Engels was appointed to organize the town's defenses, but by replacing the German black-red-gold tricolor with the red flag of communism, he alarmed his compatriots and was soon ordered to leave. As the Prussian armies cracked down on insurgents, Engels joined rebel leader August Billich in Baden, in southwestern Germany, where he took part in a battle that constituted a valiant but forlorn effort to prevent the last pockets of revolutionary resistance from being eliminated by the Prussian army. Engels retreated to Switzerland in the aftermath of the failed revolution. There he wrote an account of his experiences in The Campaign for the German Imperial Constitution, attacking the petty bourgeoisie for abandoning the workers. The experience of 1848 prompted Marx and Engels to rethink their strategy. After shutting down the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, Marx had briefly moved to Paris, but the increasingly dictatorial French government under Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the future Emperor Napoleon III, forced him into exile in London. Engels soon joined him there, and the pair would base themselves out of Britain for decades to come. In the aftermath of 1848, Marx and Engels were caught up in the recriminations over the failure of the revolution in a country that harbored revolutionary exiles from all over the continent. True to form, the pair left old comrades behind as their ideology evolved. Rather than a two-stage revolution in which they saw the proletariat working hand in hand with the petty bourgeoisie to achieve gradual social and political change, Engels and Marx now believed that the proletariat had to walk its own path in an effort to defeat the remnants of the feudal order and the prevailing capitalist order to attain socialism and communism. In addition to their political struggles, neither Marx nor Engels had much money after relocating to England at the end of the 1840s. This situation forced a reluctant Engels to return to work for the family business in Manchester. The Manchester of the early 1850s had changed considerably from Engels' experience of the city a few years earlier. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 to reduce the price of grain represented the triumph of liberalism over both aristocratic conservatism and Chartism. And while there had been some unrest in Britain in 1848, it was muted by comparison with what occurred on the continent. These developments caused Engels to lament that England was now home to both a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat. During the 1850s, the British cotton industry experienced a boom thanks to the opening of new markets in the Americas, Australia, and China via the steamships that had proliferated since the late 1830s. Ehrman and Engels' cotton sewing thread was consequently in high demand. Among Engels' tasks was to audit the company's books to ensure that his father's business partners were not undermining his interests by running side businesses. To his father's surprise, Engels conducted a thorough investigation into the company's finances, and a reconciliation of sorts between the pair occurred in 1851. Engels was subsequently granted a 7.5% share of the company's profits, what amounted to the equivalent of a six-figure salary in modern monetary terms. While Engels struggled with the uncomfortable reality that he was making money through what he perceived as exploitation of the proletariat, he consoled himself with the knowledge that he was supporting the revolutionary cause by financing Marx, often sending half his annual salary to KARL in London. Marx and Engels believed that a precondition of socialist revolution was an economic collapse that would create a vast pool of unemployed workers ready to lead the revolution. From his managerial post, Engels had an insight into the health of the global markets. But with every downturn, the English working class failed to stir. Marx and Engels had high hopes when the American Civil War badly damaged the British cotton industry in the early 1860s. This led to a decline in raw cotton from Virginia and the Carolinas for British factories to spin into processed textiles. However, British textile workers stoically endured the economic downturn, and there was no major unrest in cities like Manchester as the Civil War raged across the Atlantic between 1861 and 1865. With all quiet on the revolutionary front, Engels encouraged Marx to continue working on his extensive analysis of capitalism that would eventually become his magnum opus, Das Kapital. Marx and Engels carried on an almost daily correspondence, and the former called on the latter to provide empirical data from the factories of Manchester to support his theoretical arguments. Engels' greatest sacrifice for Marx possibly had nothing to do with money or revolutionary theory, but Marx's personal life. During these years, Engels unofficially acknowledged paternity of Henry Friedrich Demuth, a boy Marx had possibly fathered with his housekeeper Helena Demuth in 1851, during a period when KARL's wife was away from London. Marx's family was confused by Engels' dismissive attitude to young Freddie. It was only after Engels' own death, many decades later, that some of them began to suspect that Demuth was actually KARL's son. Though this remains an issue of some controversy, and many biographers of both Marx and Engels are not agreed that Demuth was in fact a son of Marx. What is clear is that Engels was living a kind of double life as well in Manchester. As a factory manager, he sought to disguise his relationship with Mary Burns, his long-term partner, though they had never married, an unusual arrangement in 19th century Europe. while keeping an official residence to maintain respectability. Engels spent much of his time living in a home which Mary lived in. From the late 1850s, Engels became a member of the prestigious Cheshire Hunt, riding alongside some of the country's most prominent aristocrats. Engels was also a leading representative of the German émigré community and a member of several exclusive private members' clubs. The stress of living his double life, combined with Marx's incessant demands for money and articles, resulted in a bout of glandular fever in 1857, and his health suffered further following his father's death in 1860, which led to an attempt by the Ehrman brothers to force him out of the company. Despite all of this, Engels found time to contribute to the revolutionary cause by further developing the theory of historical materialism, first set out in The German Ideology. For Marx and Engels, history was not determined by great men, but by socio-economic forces outside their control. In Marx's words, quote, "Men make their history, but they do not make it just as they please." In 1850, Engels had written The Peasant War in Germany, an analysis of a peasant uprising in southern Germany in the mid-1520s, inspired by the Protestant Reformation. The radical uprising had eventually been defeated. Engels drew parallels between the experiences of the German peasants of the Reformation era and the manner in which the revolutionaries of 1848 had been betrayed by the bourgeoisie. Then, in the late 1850s, with tensions growing between France, Austria, and Prussia over the prospect of Italian unification, Engels anonymously published Po and Rhine, an astute analysis of Prussia's position, which was so highly praised on the continent that it was believed to have been written by a Prussian general. Not everything was smooth sailing during these years, though. In 1863, Engels suffered a major blow in his personal life with the unexpected death of his partner, Mary Burns, in her early 40s. Engels was appalled when Marx responded to the news by complaining about his own problems and asking for money. But their friendship survived after Marx sent an apologetic letter. In the aftermath of Mary's death, Engels grew closer to her sister Lizzie, and they would eventually, after many years together, marry in 1878. As a result of his connections with the Burns sisters, Engels took a greater interest in Ireland during these years and planned to write a history of the island which would explore its position as England's first colony and the revolutionary movement there over the centuries. The project was never realized, though. In 1867, after 17 years of work, Marx had completed the manuscript of Volume 1 of Das Kapital, rewriting and editing significant parts following feedback from Engels. This, not the Communist Manifesto, was Marx's foremost work, an enormous text when the 3 volumes of it were eventually finished, one that outlined Marx's entire philosophical and political system and his view of the materialist development of human history. One of the key ideas in Das Kapital was Marx's theory of surplus value, in which he argued that every hour of production, over and above the amount necessary for a worker to make a living, was expropriated by the factory owner as profit. In more graphic terms, Marx argued emotively of the factory owners that, quote, "they mutilate the laborer into a fragment of man, degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, destroy every remnant of charm in his work, and turn it into a hated toil. The irony, of course, was that it would not have been possible for Marx to complete Das Kapital had it not been for the financial support which Engels had provided over the years, much of which ultimately derived from his holdings in and work for the Ehrmann and Engels factory. Following the publication of Das Kapital in September 1867, Engels set about publicizing the book by reaching out to contacts in Europe and America. In 1869, Engels' contract with the Ehrmann and Engels firm came to an end, and neither Engels nor Gottfried Ehrmann was keen on continuing the partnership. Anxious to get away from it all, Engels settled for a severance payment of £12,000, enough to sustain him and Marx for many years to come. Nevertheless, the often contradictory nature of Engels' activities continued, and during the 1870s, he invested much of this severance payment in the stock market to bolster his fortune. At the age of 49, he felt newly liberated, and in the summer of 1870, he and Lizzie moved to London, keen to re-enter the world of revolutionary politics. Engels was immediately elected to the International Working Men's Association, also known as the First International, a communist and radical socialist organization that had been founded in 1864. Engels was elected corresponding secretary to most European revolutionary parties, while his linguistic skills also led him to supervise the translation of his and Marx's work into a host of European languages. Engels' home at 122 Regent's Park Road soon began to attract communists from all over Europe, speaking a variety of tongues. Marx lived 10 minutes away to the north at Maitland Park Road, and Engels would visit his friend daily to exchange their latest thoughts. During this time, Marx continued to work on additional volumes of Das Kapital, while Engels pursued his own writing projects. Engels' arrival at London coincided with monumental events in continental Europe. During the 1860s, Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had set out to unite Germany by force. In 1864, the Prussian army led a German coalition to conquer the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein from Denmark. And in 1866, Prussia defeated Austria to consolidate its leading position in Germany. Feeling threatened by Prussian militarism, in 1870, Emperor Napoleon III of France declared war on Prussia after being provoked into doing so by Bismarck over a dispute regarding the succession to the throne of Spain. Thanks to Marx's connections, Engels was able to secure a role as a correspondent for the Pall Mall Gazette during the short Franco-Prussian War that followed. Through the cousin of a friend who served with the Germans, Engels was provided with details of the movements of the Prussian army, and he predicted Napoleon's defeat and capture at the Battle of Sedan on the 2nd of September 1870, earning the nickname the General from Marx. Though Marx and Engels sympathized with the Prussian cause and welcomed both the unification of Germany and the fall of the Bonapartist regime, Bismarck's demands to annex France's eastern provinces of Alsace and Lorraine prolonged the war and led to a brutal siege of Paris. Soon after the Prussians left Paris, the Parisian workers took control of the city in March 1871 and declared the establishment of the Paris Commune, a short-lived revolutionary government that was brutally suppressed by the French Third Republic in May. It is often perceived as the first effort at establishing a communist government anywhere in Europe. Meanwhile, the Franco-Prussian War had led to the creation of a German empire under Prussian domination. Marx and Engels argued that the Paris Commune had failed due to a lack of revolutionary organization and discipline, a theme that Engels returned to in his quest to undermine Mikhail Bakunin, the Russian anarchist who espoused individual freedom and saw Marxism as a recipe for authoritarianism. Although Marx and Engels successfully managed to expel Bakunin from the First International in 1872, political infighting fatally undermined the organization, which disbanded in 1876 after losing its momentum in the years after the Hague Conference of 1872. Despite its demise, Engels continued to liaise with Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel's Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany. The German socialists experienced a surge in popularity after Bismarck cracked down on left-wing party organizations in 1878 and won 12 seats in the Reichstag in the 1881 elections. From his headquarters in London, Engels wrote extensively about political developments in the new German Empire. He also took a close interest in the revolutionary movement in Russia, which was divided between the orthodox Marxism of Georgy Plekhanov and the populism of Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who saw Russian peasant communes as the model for revolutionary socialism. Although he briefly endorsed the peasant commune as the means to overthrow the hated Tsarist autocracy, Engels ultimately saw it as a conservative and reactionary institution. Few people believed at the time that communism could ultimately take root in a largely agricultural society like Russia that had only experienced limited industrialization. Aside from the task of promoting ideological unity among global communists, Engels turned his attention to the physical sciences. In Manchester, Engels had witnessed significant scientific and technological breakthroughs, and he and Marx both admired Darwin's On the Origin of Species, linking the theory of evolution and the struggle for survival to the class struggle in human society. As he and Marx had done with history, Engels sought to apply Hegelian dialectics to the natural sciences. Between 1872 and 1883, he worked on a series of essays which were eventually compiled into Dialectics of Nature and published in 1927, following a recommendation from Albert Einstein. In his essay, The Part Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man, Engels theorized that the development of opposable thumbs, resulting in the ability to make tools, enabled human beings to gain mastery over nature, and thus the demands of labor led to the formation of human societies and systems of mutual support, which in turn produced human speech and supported the development of the human brain. According to Engels, labor represented the basic condition of human existence and separated humans from animals. While this theory of the development of the human brain has subsequently been widely accepted by evolutionary biologists, Engels' scientific framework of dialectical materialism unwittingly turned science into an ideological battleground for 20th century communist regimes, leading to the rejection and persecution of scientists who adopted alternative scientific approaches. During the 1870s and 1880s, Engels also began to produce a series of pamphlets aimed at providing a concise introduction to Marx's thought for those without the time or inclination to read the cumbersome first volume of Das Kapital. The most influential of these was Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, published in French in 1880. Engels distinguished between Marx's scientific socialism as the natural successor to capitalism and the utopian socialism of other German thinkers of the time, the latter of which were deemed unrealistic in their idealism. According to Engels, once capitalism had collapsed as a result of its internal contradictions, the proletariat would seize political power and abolish all class distinctions. Under communism, the state would become superfluous and wither away, leading to the ultimate liberation of mankind. Beyond this, Engels enjoyed a semi-retirement from the mid-1870s onwards, relieved of his responsibilities as a company manager and of helping to run the now-defunct First International. He enjoyed spending time by the seaside with Lizzie and the Marx family. The sea air benefited the asthmatic Lizzie's fragile health, but she was also suffering from bladder cancer. Unlike her late sister Mary, Lizzie had retained her Catholic faith and wished to sanctify her relationship with Engels before her demise. On the 11th of September 1878, Engels summoned a nearby Anglican priest to conduct a marriage ceremony at Lizzie's bedside several hours before her death. KARL and Jenny Marx were also in increasingly poor health, and KARL was too ill to attend to Jenny when she died in November 1881. Marx lingered on for more than a year. Engels continued to visit his friend daily. He had just arrived at Marx's house on the afternoon of the 14th of March, 1883, when he died at the age of 64. Engels was one of only 11 mourners in attendance when Marx was buried alongside Jenny in Highgate Cemetery. In his eulogy, Engels declared that he was mourned by millions of revolutionary fellow workers from the mines of Siberia to California. Engels dedicated the remainder of his life to protecting and promoting Marx's work. As Marx's literary executor, Engels not only had to sift his way through Marx's drafts, but was caught in a power struggle between Marx's surviving daughters, Laura and Eleanor. In addition to supervising the translation of Marx's published works, Engels faced a monumental task in preparing the unfinished drafts of the second and third volumes of Das Kapital for publication. He was disappointed to find that Marx had been distracted from developing his arguments by collecting reams of data on the American and Russian economies. 2 years after Marx's death, Volume 2 of Das Kapital was published in German in May 1885. The third volume proved a tougher challenge, and in the interests of clarifying the line of argument, Engels allowed himself extensive editorial freedom to restructure Marx's text and introduce his own material. Thus, it was not until 1894 that Volume 3 saw the light of day, and it bore Engels' imprints more than the first 2 volumes. Among Marx's papers, Engels found a summary of a study by the American anthropologist Lewis Morgan into the transformation from tribal societies to modern civilization, which focused on the Iroquois tribal confederacy and described the change from a system of social organization of shared property and sexual partners to one of a monogamous family unit. Engels was keen to apply historical materialism to Morgan's work, and in 1884, he produced The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, in light of the researches by Lewis H. Morgan. In August 1888, at the age of 68, Engels made a visit to North America. He had high hopes for the American labor movement, which was organizing a series of strikes in response to an era of capitalist excess known as the Gilded Age. Rather than address large crowds of striking workers, Engels preferred to travel incognito from New York to Boston before returning via Canada. Although the blinding electric lighting and ubiquitous advertising in New York City gave Engels a glimpse of the future of capitalism, the trip had a revitalizing impact. Back in England, Engels sensed that the docile British working classes were at last stirring, and he joined 200,000 socialists in the inaugural May Day parade through the streets of London on the 4th of May 1890. However, the socialist revival of the 1890s was led by bourgeois intellectuals, such as the designer William Morris and the writer George Bernard Shaw, neither of whom had much interest or understanding of communist ideas. In a demonstration of loyalty to the Marx family, Engels supported Edward Aveling, Eleanor Marx's bigamous husband, whose womanizing and misappropriation of party funds was partly offset by his efforts to organize the British working classes in London's East End. Engels' favor towards Aveling gradually alienated him from the British labor movement, which coalesced behind Keir Hardie's reformist Independent Labour Party, the forerunner of the modern British Labour Party. By the late 1880s, as he entered the twilight of his life, Engels was becoming more open to the efforts of the Social Democratic Party in Germany, which was making significant progress in the elections to the German Reichstag. Still, he remained committed to communist politics, and in 1889 played a key role in the establishment of the Second International. He engaged in the speaking tour of Europe in the early 1890s, speaking in front of enthusiastic crowds as he journeyed from Zurich to Vienna and thence to Berlin, the capital of the autocratic German Empire, but also a stronghold for the Social Democratic Party. While Engels appeared in fine health during his continental European tour, the work of editing Marx's papers and defending Marxism in socialist congress halls had taken its toll on his health. His eyesight had been deteriorating for several years, and by the beginning of 1895, he was suffering from esophageal cancer. His condition rapidly deteriorated at the end of July, and he died late in the evening of the 5th of August, 1895, a few months shy of his 75th birthday. Without any children of his own, he left more than half his estate to Marx's daughters Laura and Eleanor, while appointing the latter as her father's literary executor. In accordance with his will, his remains were cremated and cast out to sea off the south coast of England. Unlike Marx's famous tomb at Highgate, Engels would have no grave or funerary monument. Friedrich Engels leaves behind a complicated legacy. He was one of the most important figures in the history of communism, though he was always being overshadowed within the communist movement by his lifelong collaborator, Karl Marx. Yet Engels was an important figure in his own right. From an early age, he adopted an antagonistic attitude towards his family's capitalist wealth and took his own independent path, though he later reconciled with his father and was happy to live off the proceeds of an industrial company, even while criticizing the economic system which allowed it to thrive. His collaboration with Marx began in the mid-1840s and continued for half a century beyond Marx's own time, with Engels being responsible for editing and finishing the second and third volumes of Marx's Das Kapital in the 1880s and 1890s. The pair are widely known for co-authoring the Communist Manifesto. Though Marx primarily wrote it, it was a distillation of their collective views. However, Engels should not be viewed entirely in the shadow of Marx's work. He was a formidable writer and social critic in his own right. In particular, The Social Condition of the Working Class in England, written by Engels when he was still a young man in his early to mid-20s, is considered today as a classic account of the effects of industrialization on England in the middle of the 19th century. Regardless of how one perceives Engels' wider politics, there is no denying that given the crimes of the communist regimes of the 20th century, that Engels and Marx are both controversial figures in many ways. But at the same time, Engels should not merely be viewed as an editor of Marx's work or a sidekick of some kind, but rather as a substantial political writer in his own right. What do you think of Friedrich Engels? Was he an effective critic of industrial capitalism, whose contributions to communist ideology were as impactful as those of Karl Marx? Or does he share responsibility for the brutality and bloodshed that accompanied the communist dictatorships of the 20th century in Europe and further afield? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.